Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Life-Changing True Stories. Today, we step into a story not about wealth or power, but about courage, choices, and the cost of dignity when life forces you to choose between your pride and the heartbeat of someone you love. The rain had been falling for hours, turning the streets of Manhattan into mirrors of trembling gold. Reflections of passing taxis stretched and broke apart beneath Sofia Martinez's feet as she hurried along the slick pavement, clutching her thin jacket tighter. The wind cut through the city like a blade, howling between the skyscrapers, tugging at her hair and scattering the few coins in the tip jar she carried home from her late shift. It was almost midnight, but she didn't mind. The quiet hours had always been her peace, those moments after the noise of the day died down, when the world forgot her name and she could simply breathe without expectation. But tonight her chest felt heavy. The hospital bills on the kitchen table had grown into a mountain, and her sister Camilla's medication bottle was almost empty again. Sofia had learned early that life didn't reward goodness. It rewarded persistence. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3 when someone needed a shift covered. But no matter how hard she pushed, the finish line always moved further away. Yet she smiled every morning because Camilla needed her to. Camilla, who at just 20 had dreams far larger than the small apartment they shared. She wanted to teach, to travel, to stand in front of a classroom full of children and tell them that hope was real. But the universe, in its cruel irony, had given her a heart too fragile to chase those dreams without help. The doctors called it a congenital defect. Sofia called it a curse she was determined to break. The next morning, as the first light bled across the skyline, Sofia sat at the edge of her bed, scrolling through job postings on her old phone, each rejection from the previous day echoing in her mind. "We're sorry, but we've decided to move forward with another candidate." She had read those words so many times they had lost meaning. Still, she pressed on, applying to every position within reach. Assistant, clerk, caretaker, anything. Then a notification popped up on her screen. Event staffing for high-profile charity gala. Immediate hiring, excellent pay. Sofia hesitated. The Grand Luminara Hotel was one of the most exclusive venues in the city, the kind of place people like her only saw on magazine covers. But she needed the money, and more importantly, Camilla needed the medicine that money could buy. She clicked apply. By evening, she found herself standing in the hotel's grand ballroom, surrounded by chandeliers that looked like frozen waterfalls of light. The scent of roses and expensive perfume filled the air, masking the faint tang of champagne. Her uniform was crisp and freshly pressed, borrowed from the staff wardrobe room. Every detail of the place whispered opulence, from the velvet curtains to the marble floors that seemed to hum under her careful steps. She kept her head down, focusing on her tray of glasses, counting them silently to steady her breathing. Around her, laughter rippled like a song she didn't belong to. Then, through the noise, she heard a voice, low, steady, and commanding. "Careful, that tray looks heavier than you." Sofia looked up instinctively and her heart stuttered. The man standing before her seemed to belong to another world entirely. His suit was a shade of charcoal that caught the light like liquid silver, tailored perfectly to broad shoulders and a lean frame. His face was cut with sharp angles, not harsh but carved with precision. And his eyes were the color of smoke over water, gray, unreadable, and strangely distant. Julian Ashford. She recognized him instantly. Everyone in the city did. Billionaire investor, technology visionary, a man whose empire stretched across continents and whose name made headlines every week. Sofia swallowed, forcing a polite smile. "Good evening, sir." Julian's gaze lingered a moment too long. "You work here?" "Yes, sir. Temporary staff." He nodded slowly, almost as if he were studying something far beyond the surface. "You have steady hands." She didn't know what to say to that. Compliments from men in expensive suits usually carried hidden intentions, but his tone was analytical, not flirtatious. Still, his presence made her uneasy, not out of fear, but from a strange awareness that this brief exchange might matter more than it should. Hours passed, and the night blurred into a pattern of serving and smiling. By the time the last guests began to leave, Sofia's feet ached and her uniform was damp with sweat from the kitchen heat. She was collecting empty glasses near the balcony doors when she heard raised voices inside the main hall. Julian Ashford was arguing with someone. An older man in a tailored navy tuxedo, clearly another figure of influence. I said no. Julian's voice was low but sharp, controlled fury beneath the surface. We do this my way or not at all. You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment, the older man snapped. If you want to keep your position on the board, you'll present a stable front. Investors don't trust bachelors. Appearances matter. Sophia froze. That last line echoed in her mind, though she wasn't sure why. Julian turned away, his expression unreadable. Then maybe I'll just have to change the appearance, he muttered, half to himself. Sophia slipped quietly out of sight before he could notice her. But fate, as always, had its own plans. When she stepped outside after her shift, the rain had started again, soft and silver, like the night was crying for someone's story. She wrapped her jacket around herself and headed toward the bus stop, but a sleek black car rolled to a stop beside her. The tinted window lowered, revealing those same gray eyes. Get in, Julian said simply. Sophia blinked. Excuse me? I'll drive you home. It's late, and this isn't the safest part of town. I can manage, thank you. I insist. His tone was final, not commanding exactly, but impossible to argue with. Against her better judgment, she hesitated, then opened the door and slid into the passenger seat. The warmth of the car enveloped her instantly, and the faint scent of leather and cologne filled the air. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The city lights streaked past the windows like falling stars, reflecting off the quiet intensity of Julian's expression. Finally, he broke the silence. You don't belong in that ballroom, she frowned. You said that earlier. What did you mean? You carry yourself differently, he said. Most people in that room are either desperate to impress or terrified to be seen. You were neither. You moved as if you were invisible, but with dignity. Sophia looked out the window, unsure how to respond. Compliments made her uncomfortable, especially from men like him. Invisible is safer, she murmured. Julian's jaw flexed. That's a cruel truth. When they reached her building, a narrow, aging apartment complex tucked between two shuttered shops, she thanked him softly and reached for the door handle. But his voice stopped her. Sophia. She turned. I'm looking for someone who can pretend to belong in my world, he said carefully. A temporary arrangement. Nothing improper, I assure you, but it could change your life. Her pulse quickened. What exactly are you offering? Not tonight, Julian said. Think of this as an introduction. I'll send a car for you tomorrow. Noon. We'll talk. Before she could respond, the car door unlocked and she stepped out into the drizzle. The car disappeared into the night like a ghost. Sophia stood under the dim streetlight, her heart pounding, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or run. She had spent years working to avoid men like him, men whose wealth gave them the illusion of control. Yet something in his voice had not been arrogance. It had been purpose. She didn't understand it yet, but deep down, she felt the universe had just opened a door she was not ready to walk through. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, the wind carried faint echoes of the city's rhythm, distant sirens, honking cars, the heartbeat of millions chasing survival. Inside, Camilla was asleep, her breathing shallow but peaceful. Sophia tucked the blanket around her sister and sat by the window, watching the rain trace slow rivers down the glass. Somewhere in the maze of that glittering city, a man named Julian Ashford was planning something that would pull her into a world she didn't belong to, a world that might save her sister's life, but would test the limits of her courage, her heart, and everything she thought she was. And as the night deepened, she whispered to herself, whatever this is, I'll face it. Not for me and for her. Morning came slowly to the city, pouring light across the skyline like a new beginning, pretending to be gentle. Sophia awoke before dawn, the world still gray, the air carrying that fragile silence that comes only before everything starts to move again. She stood by the window, holding her coffee mug close to her chest, watching the steam rise and twist in the faint glow of the street lamps below. Camilla was still asleep, her hair fanned out over the pillow, her face peaceful in the soft light, but Sophia knew peace was fragile, something that slipped through your fingers if you held it too tightly. The doctor's words from the last appointment still haunted her like an echo. We're running out of time. She pressed a trembling hand to the window pane and whispered a prayer, not to any god in particular, but to fate itself, If there was a door still open, she would walk through it, no matter the cost. At exactly noon, as promised, a black car waited outside her building. Sophia hesitated at the doorway, looking at her reflection in the cracked mirror. She had chosen a simple outfit, a pale blue blouse and black trousers, but no matter what she wore, she couldn't erase the quiet exhaustion written across her eyes. The driver greeted her politely, offering no conversation, and the ride to Julian Ashford's office felt both endless and impossibly fast, every second dragging her closer to something she couldn't yet define. When they arrived, the building loomed above her, 40 floors of glass and power, its mirrored walls reflecting a sky that seemed too bright for what she was about to do. Inside, the air was cool and perfectly still, scented faintly of cedar and polish. The receptionist, dressed immaculately in black, greeted her with the kind of professional smile that gave nothing away. "Mr. Ashford is expecting you," she said, guiding Sophia to a private elevator that climbed silently to the top floor. When the doors opened, Sophia stepped into a world of understated luxury, dark wood, modern art, and a view of the entire city stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Julian stood there looking out over it all, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture straight and deliberate, like a man who carried the weight of every decision he'd ever made but refused to let it show. "Sophia," he said without turning, his voice steady, measured, "thank you for coming." "I'm not sure why I did," she replied quietly, "but I'm here." He finally faced her, his gray eyes unreadable. "That's enough for now." He gestured toward the table where 2 glasses of water waited. "Please sit." Sophia did, her back straight, her nerves humming. "You said you had a proposal." "Yes," Julian said, sitting across from her. "And before I explain it, I need you to understand something. I don't make offers I can't keep, and I don't play games." "Good," she said softly, "because I've had enough of those to last a lifetime." Julian studied her for a moment, as if weighing not just her words but the spaces between them. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said finally. "Someone who believed the world could be fixed by effort alone." "Maybe it can," she said, "if you don't give up." A flicker of something, admiration maybe, passed through his eyes, then vanished. "Your sister's condition," he said abruptly. "I made some calls this morning." Sophia's heart clenched. "How do you even know about that?" "I make it my business to know the truth about people I intend to invest in," Julian said evenly. "Camilla's case is serious but not hopeless. There's a specialist in Zurich who has a track record of success with this kind of defect. The cost is high, but the outcome could change everything." Sophia's throat tightened. "And you're telling me this because I can make it happen," he said simply. "But I want something in return." There it was, the inevitable price. Sophia leaned back slightly, bracing herself. "Go on." "I need a wife," Julian said. The words hit like a physical blow. Sophia blinked, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "On paper only," he clarified, his tone as calm as if he were discussing a contract. "For a limited period of time. 1 year." Sophia stared at him, trying to find the trick, the joke, the hidden cruelty in his voice. "You can't be serious." "I am. A merger I'm finalizing requires stability in appearance. My board and the other company's founder are traditionalists. They value family image. A married man appears grounded, reliable, safe. So you want to buy an image," she said bitterly. "I want to secure a deal that will affect thousands of employees, hundreds of families," Julian corrected. "But I also want to help your sister. Both can happen." "If you agree," Sophia laughed once, dry, disbelieving. "You think you can solve my life like one of your business equations? Money for loyalty, signatures for salvation?" He didn't flinch. "No, I think we can help each other. You need resources. I need reliability. You get financial stability. Your sister gets her surgery and I get the appearance of a steady life. 1 year, then it ends quietly." Silence stretched between them, thick as fog. Sophia's thoughts raced. Camilla's pale face, the bills piling higher. The endless cycle of fear and exhaustion. Every rational part of her screamed no, but reality whispered, "What if this is the only way? What's in it for you besides your business deal?" she asked carefully. Julian looked at her for a long moment. "You think I'm the kind of man who only does things for profit," he said. "I think you're the kind of man who doesn't do anything without a reason." A faint smile ghosted across his lips. "Fair enough. Let's just say You interest me. You don't bend. You don't flatter. Most people in my orbit forget how to look someone in the eye without calculating what it's worth. You don't do that. Sophia folded her hands in her lap, her pulse a steady drumbeat of confusion and disbelief. So this is about trust? Something like that, he said. Or maybe redemption. The word hung between them like a challenge. Julian reached into his briefcase and slid a folder across the table. Here's the agreement. You'll find every clause clearly stated. No intimacy required. No obligations beyond public appearances and social events. You'll live in my house, have access to your own quarters and a personal allowance for independence. At the end of the year, you receive a settlement and full coverage for your sister's lifelong care. Sophia didn't touch the folder. Her hands felt too cold to move. You've done this before, haven't you? His eyes darkened slightly. No, I've offered many deals. None like this. She stood, pacing slowly to the window. The city stretched endlessly below. Cars like fireflies, people like shadows, each one chasing something they couldn't quite catch. This isn't a business decision, Julian. It's a life. I know, he said quietly. That's why I'm asking, not demanding. Sophia turned to face him, her eyes glistening. Why me? Julian hesitated, then spoke with surprising honesty. Because you remind me that humanity still exists in a world I've spent years turning to stone. And because I believe you'd never lie to me. Not for money, not for comfort. I need that truth around me right now. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then Sophia looked away, her vision blurring as tears filled her eyes. I can't decide this now. You don't have to, Julian said gently. Take the night. But remember, time isn't kind to hesitation. When she left the building, the afternoon had deepened into dusk, the sky painted in strokes of rose and gray. She walked aimlessly for blocks, the folder still unopened in her bag. Her mind torn between disbelief and desperate hope. Every part of her wanted to hate him, to reject the arrogance of a man who thought he could rewrite her life with a contract. Yet behind his composure, she had glimpsed something she hadn't expected. Loneliness. The kind that no amount of wealth could cure. Hours later, she found herself sitting by Camilla's bedside again, the dim hospital lights flickering softly above. Camilla stirred awake and smiled faintly. You look tired, she whispered. I'm fine, Sophia said, brushing a strand of hair from her sister's forehead. Liar, Camilla murmured. You always look like the world is on your shoulders. Sophia laughed softly, though it broke something inside her. Maybe because it is. Camilla reached for her hand. Whatever you're thinking of doing to help me, just make sure it doesn't break you. Those words stayed with Sophia long after Camilla drifted back to sleep. As she sat there in the half-darkness, watching the machines blink and hum beside the bed, she realized that every choice in life came with a price. Sometimes pride, sometimes peace, sometimes both. The question wasn't whether she could afford to pay it, but whether she could afford not to. When dawn came again, pale and uncertain, Sophia was already dressed. The contract was tucked neatly into her bag, unsigned but no longer ignored. Her reflection in the elevator mirror looked almost like someone else, a woman standing at the edge of something vast and dangerous, a woman about to gamble her heart for a chance at saving another. And as the car carried her once more through the awakening city toward Julian Ashford's world, Sophia whispered to herself, if this is the door fate opened, then I'm walking through. The morning of the wedding arrived not with fanfare, but with a hush that carried the weight of finality. The sky was clear and pale, the kind of fragile blue that belongs to beginnings no one fully trusts. Sophia stood before the mirror in a small private room at the courthouse, dressed in a simple cream-colored dress that one of Julian's assistants had chosen. It wasn't a gown, not really, but it was elegant in its quiet way. Soft fabric that moved like breath, light on her skin yet heavy with meaning. She studied her reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back. Gone was the waitress who lived between exhaustion and obligation. In her place stood someone who looked composed, distant and strangely serene, as if she had accepted the price of a bargain that could never be undone. Her hands trembled once and she clasped them together to still them, whispering to her reflection, "This isn't forever. This is survival." When she stepped into the marble-lined hall, Julian was waiting. He wore a black suit with the clean precision of someone who lived his life in straight lines and sharp corners. The moment their eyes met, time seemed to pause, not in romance, but in recognition. Two souls caught in the machinery of necessity. He gave her a small nod, and that tiny gesture carried more gravity than any vow. The officiant, a man with kind eyes and a practiced smile, read the legal words that would bind them, his voice echoing faintly off the high ceiling. There were no rings, no music, no gathered guests. Only two signatures, two witnesses, and a silence that settled over them like a second skin. When it was done, Julian offered his hand. "Mrs. Ashford," he said formally, and though his tone was measured, something flickered behind his composure. Respect, perhaps, or the faint awareness that life had just shifted its course. Sophia took his hand, not as a lover, not even as a partner, but as someone stepping into the unknown because there was no other road left open. That evening, the limousine carried them through the city, away from the courthouse and into the quiet suburbs where Julian's mansion waited, a sprawling estate of glass, stone, and water. As the car turned through the gates, Sophia felt the weight of luxury pressing down on her like a shadow. The gardens glowed under the soft wash of golden lights, fountains murmured softly, and the house itself looked like something out of another existence. When she entered the foyer, she had to remind herself to breathe. The ceiling soared high enough to swallow sound, and every surface gleamed with careful perfection. A housekeeper greeted her warmly, leading her through polished hallways toward the wing that would be hers. "This is your room, Mrs. Ashford," the woman said, opening a door that revealed a suite larger than Sophia's entire apartment. There was a balcony that overlooked the garden, a library wall filled with books, and a bed so large it looked almost ceremonial. Sophia thanked her softly, closing the door behind her once she was alone. She pressed her palms to her face and let out a breath that trembled with disbelief. This wasn't her world, and no amount of fine fabric or marble could make it feel like home. Julian knocked gently later that evening, his voice calm but hesitant. "May I?" She nodded, and he stepped in, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "I thought you might need this," he said. She accepted it, the warmth seeping through her fingers. For a while neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was contemplative, heavy with the unspoken understanding that both had sacrificed something intangible. Finally, Julian said quietly, "You don't owe me gratitude, Sophia. What I offered was transactional. You accepted it with dignity. That deserves respect." She met his gaze, searching for arrogance but finding none. "And you don't owe me pity," she replied. "I knew what I signed." He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words. "Still," he said, "if we're going to live under the same roof, we should understand one another. My world runs on order and precision, but I don't want this house to feel like a prison for you. You'll have access to anything you need. Your sister's treatment begins next week. She'll be moved to a private facility near here." At that, Sophia's composure faltered. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking despite her effort to hold it steady. Julian looked away, giving her space to collect herself, then said quietly, "No one ever thanks me like that. Most people just take what they can and move on." "Maybe they never needed something this much," she said. He didn't respond, but she saw a flicker of something soften in his expression. Not affection, not yet, but empathy. Days became weeks, and their arrangement found its rhythm. Sophia spent mornings at the hospital with Camilla, afternoons studying nursing again as Julian had promised, and evenings attending the occasional social event by his side. In public, they played their roles flawlessly. The world saw a poised young wife and her successful husband, the perfect image of elegance and stability. Cameras flashed, headlines speculated, and investors nodded approvingly. Yet behind the closed doors of their home, they lived parallel lives bound by courtesy and unspoken boundaries. They dined together sometimes, silent meals punctuated by the clink of silverware, and occasionally exchanged small details about their days. He would ask about Camilla's progress, and Sophia would ask about his company's new projects, both careful never to tread too close to vulnerability. But as the months passed, something began to shift quietly, almost imperceptibly. Julian, who had built his empire on logic, found himself drawn to the calm resilience that Sophia carried like armor. He would watch her reading by the window some evenings, the sunset catching in her hair, and wonder how someone who had seen so much struggle could still hold herself with such quiet grace. She in turn began to see beneath the marble surface of his life. The exhaustion in his eyes when he returned late from meetings, the untouched piano in the corner of his study, the loneliness that lived like a shadow in his immaculate world. One night after a particularly tense charity gala, Sophia found Julian on the terrace, his tie loosened, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. The city lights stretched endlessly below. She hesitated, then joined him, leaning against the railing. "You don't like those events, do you?" she said softly. He gave a dry laugh. "They're performance art, everyone pretending to care just enough to be photographed." "Then why go?" she asked. "Because appearances feed the machine," he said. "And the machine feeds everyone else." She studied him quietly. "You sound like a man who built a kingdom and discovered he doesn't like ruling it." His head turned slightly, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Maybe I just forgot what it felt like to build for something real." "Then remember," she said simply. "Start with that." It was the first time he looked at her not as an arrangement, not as an equation, but as someone capable of seeing him when he no longer saw himself. From that night on, something unspoken grew between them, fragile, cautious, but undeniable. They never crossed the boundaries they had set, yet the air between them began to hum with a strange kind of understanding. He would leave small gestures, a book she had once mentioned appearing on her nightstand, a note left on the breakfast table reminding her to rest, her favorite tea stocked in the pantry. And Sophia, without meaning to, found herself worrying when he skipped meals or came home late, silently waiting to hear his footsteps in the hall before she allowed herself to sleep. Camilla's recovery brought light into their world. The surgery in Zurich succeeded beyond expectation, and every update from the doctors painted a picture of new beginnings. When she returned home, fragile but alive, she threw her arms around Sophia and whispered, "You did it." Sophia smiled through tears, knowing that she hadn't done it alone. Julian had kept every promise. And yet gratitude was a dangerous thing. It made you see kindness where maybe there was only responsibility, and warmth where there should have been distance. One quiet evening, months into the marriage, Sophia walked into the library to find Julian asleep at his desk. Papers scattered, his head resting on his folded arms. The lamplight cast a soft glow over his face, stripping away the armor of power and leaving only weariness. She stood there for a long time, unsure why her heart ached at the sight. Finally, she reached out and gently draped a blanket over his shoulders. He stirred slightly, eyes half opening. "Sophia," he murmured, "you should rest." "So should you," she whispered back. For a heartbeat, their eyes held on an unguarded human, painfully real. Then she turned and left before the silence could turn into something neither of them was ready to name. That night, Julian dreamt of his late mother for the first time in years, a woman who used to tell him that wealth meant nothing if it couldn't make someone's world brighter. He woke before dawn, the house still quiet, and realized that Sophia had done exactly that without ever trying. She had filled his silence with meaning. In the months that followed, rumors swirled in the media, whispers of affection, of genuine connection between the Ashfords. Julian ignored them and Sophia learned to smile through them. But somewhere between the pretense and the truth, the lines began to blur. What had started as survival was becoming something that neither contract nor logic could define. And though both still spoke with restraint and acted with control, the air in that vast mansion began to feel less like marble and more like home. As spring turned to summer, the deal that had sparked everything approached its conclusion. The merger was a triumph. Julian's company soared, and investors lauded his leadership. Yet the victory felt strangely hollow. He found himself standing in the same ballroom where he had first met Sophia, surrounded by the same laughter and glitter, but the noise now rang empty. He watched her across the room, radiant in a navy dress, her laughter genuine as she spoke with a group of guests. And for the first time in his life, Julian Ashford realized he was afraid. Afraid that when the year ended and the contract dissolved, he would lose something no fortune could buy, the quiet, steady light that had taught him what humanity truly looked like. And somewhere in the depths of that awareness, a thought took root, one he could no longer dismiss as business nor disguise as convenience. For the first time, he wanted to rewrite the contract, not on paper but in life. Autumn crept across the city with quiet precision, turning the trees outside the Ashford estate into mosaics of amber and rust. The mornings grew cooler and thin veils of mist curled over the garden ponds like breath from a sleeping world. Sophia had begun to rise early, long before the household stirred, walking the stone paths in silence, letting the chill wake her mind. The leaves beneath her shoes made soft whispers, and the sky, still heavy with dawn, seemed to carry questions she could not answer. 9 months had passed since the courthouse wedding. 9 months of adaptation, discipline, and carefully maintained distance. Yet somewhere between the routine of shared dinners and silent car rides, something fragile had begun to change inside her. It wasn't love in the storybook sense. It was subtler, quieter, a recognition that Julian Ashford, the man she once thought carved from ambition and ice, was slowly learning to feel again. Julian had always measured his days in contracts and deadlines, but lately he found himself noticing things that had nothing to do with business. He noticed the way Sophia hummed faintly while arranging flowers in the sitting room, a tune so soft it seemed meant only for the air around her. He noticed how she never sat idly. She was always reading, tending, creating. There was order in her world, but also warmth, a kind of deliberate gentleness that unsettled him. She had an ability to turn silence into comfort, and he, who had spent years mastering the art of control, realized that her presence was undoing him in ways he couldn't define. He told himself it was gratitude that she had fulfilled her role flawlessly, that she had brought peace to Camilla's recovery and grace to his public image, but gratitude could not explain why his heart stalled whenever she laughed or why he found excuses to pass by the room where she was reading, pretending to retrieve a file he didn't need. Camilla, fully recovered now and studying part-time at a nearby university, sensed the unspoken current between them long before either of them dared to name it. She often teased her sister gently, telling her that the man she called Mr. Ashford in public watched her with the expression of someone who had forgotten how to hide emotion. Sophia always brushed it off with a laugh, insisting that what existed between them was mutual respect, nothing more. Yet at night, when the house was still and she sat by her window journaling, she would pause mid-sentence, her pen hovering, as the sound of Julian's footsteps crossed the hall below. It was a rhythm she had grown used to, steady, deliberate, reassuring in a strange way. And though she told herself not to care, she found herself waiting for it just to know he had come home safely. The turning point arrived on an evening painted in rain. Julian had returned late from a board meeting, soaked and visibly exhausted. The storm outside had turned violent, the wind lashing against the windows like a living thing. Sophia was in the kitchen, barefoot, brewing chamomile tea for herself when he entered quietly. His shirt damp at the collar, his tie loosened, his eyes shadowed by fatigue. For a moment neither spoke. The only sound was the steady rhythm of rain against glass. Then, almost without thought, she poured a second cup and slid it across the counter toward him. He hesitated, then accepted it. They stood there in silence, the steam curling between them, fragile and warm. "Rough day?" she asked softly. "Rough decade," he murmured, half smiling, half defeated. Something in his voice broke through her restraint, and before she could stop herself, she said, "Then maybe it's time to stop measuring your worth by battles fought and start counting the moments you still have left to feel alive." Julian looked at her, startled by the directness, by the kindness laced through her words. No one spoke to him that way, no one dared. The people around him saw power, money, strategy. She saw the man beneath all that armor. He set the cup down slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "You think I've forgotten how to live?" he asked quietly. "I think you stopped allowing yourself to," she replied, "because somewhere along the way you decided pain was safer than hope." The words struck deeper than she intended. For a moment he didn't move. Then in a voice that was almost a whisper he said, "You make it sound like I could still change." "Everyone can," she said simply, "even the ones who stopped believing they could." That night something wordless settled between them. Not desire, but understanding. Julian began to shift in small human ways. He took evenings off occasionally, learned how to cook breakfast on Sundays, even laughed. An unguarded, surprised sound when Camilla tricked him into tasting one of her oversweet experiments from the kitchen. The house, once a monument to silence, began to feel alive again. The staff whispered that Mrs. Ashford had brought light back into the corridors. though neither of them acknowledged it aloud. Still, the ticking clock of their arrangement loomed closer with each passing week. The contract's end date, once a distant idea, now hovered just beyond the horizon. Sophia avoided thinking about it, burying herself in her studies and volunteer work at a local clinic. But every so often she would catch Julian watching her with that quiet, conflicted look, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. It wasn't until one crisp evening in October that the dam finally broke. They were sitting in the garden, wrapped in the mellow light of lanterns and the scent of rain-soaked earth. The world around them felt suspended, like a painting caught between motion and stillness. Julian was unusually quiet, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. "Do you ever wonder what happens after the contract ends?" he asked at last. Sophia's heart skipped, but she forced a calm tone. "We return to our lives," she said. "You to your empire, me to mine." He turned to face her, his eyes darker than the twilight. "And if I told you I don't want to go back to the way things were?" She looked at him carefully, her pulse tightening. "Then I'd say that wasn't part of the agreement." "I know," he said softly. "But agreements can evolve." Sophia's breath caught somewhere between fear and longing. She wanted to tell him not to say it, that their arrangement had boundaries for a reason, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she said, "Julian, what we built was meant to be temporary. You helped me save Camilla. You gave us a future. That's more than enough." He shook his head slowly. "You call it temporary. I call it the only time I've ever felt human." The confession hung in the air, heavy, unguarded. Sophia looked away, her throat tight. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "You're grateful, that's all." "Gratitude doesn't keep me awake thinking about what will happen when you walk out of this house," he said. "Gratitude doesn't make me afraid to lose something I can't define." The vulnerability in his voice startled her. It was stripped of every layer of control that usually armored him. She stood, unable to meet his gaze, staring instead at the garden lights reflected in the water. "Julian, we can't rewrite what this is. It started as a transaction." "Then let me earn the right to make it real," he said quietly. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of falling leaves and something aching in its honesty. Finally, Sophia turned toward him. "You once told me I gave you back your humanity," she said softly. "Then let me keep mine. I can't stay here because of obligation or confusion or loneliness, even yours. I need to finish this year with the same dignity I started it." Her words were gentle but firm, and he nodded slowly, understanding what she couldn't yet say, that love built on debt would always feel like captivity. That night, Julian didn't sleep. He walked the empty halls of the mansion until dawn, each step echoing with memories. Her laughter in the kitchen, her quiet voice reciting lines from a book, the way she looked at him as if she saw through the noise of his life. For the first time, he understood what it meant to lose something that had never belonged to you in the first place. He stood before the great window of his study as the first light crept over the horizon and whispered into the stillness, "If freedom is what she needs, then that's what I'll give her." In the days that followed, Julian became distant, almost mechanical again, burying himself in work. Sophia noticed but said nothing. She told herself it was for the best. That distance would make the end easier. Yet her heart rebelled against logic. She found herself missing the sound of his voice, the quiet companionship of their shared silences. Even Camilla, perceptive as ever, noticed the shift. "You look sadder now that things are calm," she told her sister one evening. Sophia forced a smile. "Sometimes peace feels like loss when you've gotten used to fighting." When winter came, the first snow blanketed the gardens in white. Sophia stood by the window of her room watching it fall, each flake delicate, perfect, fleeting. In another few weeks the year would end, and with it their agreement. She would move out, continue her studies, and start a new chapter far from the mansion's echoing halls. That was the plan, logical, clean, final. But plans are fragile things, easily rewritten by the heart. Downstairs, Julian stood by the grand piano, his fingers brushing the keys. He hadn't played in years, not since before success became his only language. But tonight he sat down and let the music return. The melody was simple, hesitant at first, then growing bolder like memory finding its voice. Sophia, hearing it from above, descended the staircase quietly. She stopped at the doorway watching him, the notes filling the space between them with everything they could not say. When he finally looked up, their eyes met, and for a heartbeat all the pretense fell away. Neither spoke because words would have broken the spell. In that fragile silence, as the snow fell beyond the glass and the last notes lingered in the air, both understood what the other felt, but also what must still come. Some loves are born not to possess but to transform. Some connections exist not to claim but to awaken. And as the year neared its end, both Sophia Martinez and Julian Ashford stood on the edge of that realization, not knowing whether their story would close as a contract fulfilled or begin anew as a promise made from the heart. Winter had settled fully upon the city, a quiet dominion of frost and silence. The days were shorter now, the light pale and sharp, painting the world in tones of pearl and shadow. Inside the Ashford estate, warmth still lingered. Fireplaces crackled in distant rooms and faint music played through the hallways like memory refusing to fade. Yet beneath that surface calm, both Sophia and Julian carried the weight of an approaching end. The contract that had once seemed like salvation was now a countdown neither of them wanted to reach zero. The date circled in the folder on Julian's desk, the official conclusion of their year together, was only 2 weeks away. It lay there like a sentence written long ago waiting to be carried out. Sophia had spent the morning packing small things, though she told herself it was just preparation. The books she'd read during sleepless nights, the sketches Camilla had drawn after her recovery, the scarf she'd worn that first winter in the house. She folded them all carefully into boxes. The motions were methodical, almost meditative, but beneath her calm exterior a quiet ache pulsed steadily. Every corner of this house had a memory now. The library that had once been intimidating now felt like a sanctuary. The kitchen where she and Julian had shared silent breakfasts. Even the garden path lined with lanterns where he had first confessed his fear of losing her. Each memory felt like a thread woven into her, and the thought of pulling away from it made her chest tighten. Julian, for his part, threw himself into work again, using busyness as a shield. Meetings, conferences, endless reports. Anything to drown out the truth he could no longer deny. He told himself this distance was mercy, that letting her go without burdening her with his feelings was the right thing. But every evening when he returned to the house, every time he found her absence in a room where she used to sit reading or writing, the logic unraveled. He would catch glimpses of her through doorways, the faint light falling on her hair as she packed or wrote in her journal, and the words he needed to say would rise in his throat only to dissolve again. How do you confess love to someone who entered your life through a contract? How do you tell her that what began as obligation had become the only thing that made sense? Camilla sensed the tension but said nothing. She had grown stronger, happier, her laughter now bright enough to fill the quiet corners of their lives. One evening, as Sophia brushed her sister's hair, Camilla said softly, "You're scared." Sophia froze, comb in hand. "Of what?" she asked lightly. "Of leaving something you don't want to admit has become home." Sophia looked down, unable to answer. Camilla smiled gently. "You taught me that love doesn't always start right. Sometimes it begins where everything is wrong and still it becomes the only thing that makes sense." Then she turned and hugged her sister. "Whatever you choose, make sure it's from your heart, not from fear." Those words followed Sophia through the next few days like an echo she couldn't silence. She threw herself into finishing her last nursing certification exams, into hospital volunteer work, into every task that could fill the hours. But still, Julian's absence weighed on her like gravity. Each time they crossed paths, there was a politeness between them that cut sharper than distance. He would nod, ask about Camilla, about her studies, his voice measured and respectful, but behind his composure she sensed the same turmoil she carried. It was as if they were both waiting for someone to break the silence, but neither dared to destroy the fragile peace they had built. The first snow of the new year arrived on a Sunday. The morning light was silver and clean, and the world outside seemed frozen in stillness. Sophia walked through the garden in her coat, her breath forming soft clouds in the cold air. She paused by the fountain, now edged with ice, and stared at her reflection trembling on the surface. She had thought freedom was all she ever wanted, to live without dependency, to stand on her own terms. But now she realized that freedom meant nothing if it required erasing something genuine. She loved him. She had tried not to, tried to keep her heart disciplined, but love had grown quietly, patiently, in all the spaces where gratitude once lived. And yet that love felt impossible, because it was born of a promise that had an expiration date. Later that day, Julian returned early from his meetings, his car wheels crunching over the gravel driveway. He stepped out and saw her through the window, standing near the fountain. For a moment he simply watched, the way the wind lifted strands of her hair, the way her posture carried that mix of strength and sorrow that had undone him from the start. Something in him broke then, not with pain but with clarity. He could no longer keep his distance, no longer pretend that business or duty outweighed what his heart already knew. He found her still standing there when he walked outside, his coat open, the cold biting but unheeded. "Sophia," he said, his voice softer than it had ever been. She turned, startled, her eyes bright against the pale winter light. "Julian," she said quietly, "you shouldn't be out here without a coat." He smiled faintly. "You sound like someone who still cares." She looked away, her hands tightening around her gloves. "Of course I care. You're—" She stopped herself, searching for the right word, but none fit. He stepped closer, the snow crunching beneath his shoes. "The contract ends in 2 weeks," he said. "I know," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And then you'll be free." "Free to what?" he asked. "To go back to the man I was before? The one who mistook control for strength and isolation for safety. I don't want that life anymore." Sophia swallowed hard, the air burning cold in her lungs. "Julian, please don't make this harder. You've already given me more than I could ever repay." "I never wanted repayment," he said firmly. "I wanted to help because you reminded me what it meant to care. And somewhere along the way I stopped doing it out of debt. I did it because I needed you in my life. Not as part of an agreement, but as part of me." His words cracked something open in her chest. Tears stung her eyes and she shook her head. "You don't mean that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're just afraid of losing what's familiar." "No," he said, stepping closer until the air between them seemed to hum with truth. "I'm afraid of losing what's real." The wind howled softly through the trees, carrying the faint scent of snow and cedar. Sophia stood motionless, her heart warring between logic and longing. "When we started this," she said slowly, "I promised myself I would never let it become more than what it was. I told myself this was survival, not love." She paused, tears glistening. "But somewhere along the way you became the person I looked for when the day ended. You became the silence that felt like peace. And that terrifies me, Julian, because I don't know who I am when I stop surviving and start feeling." He reached out then, not to pull her close, but to simply take her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "Then let's find out together," he said. "No contracts, no obligations. Just choice." For a moment neither spoke. The only sound was the faint trickle of water beneath the ice and the quiet rhythm of two hearts, finally finding the same beat. Then Sophia took a deep breath, steady and clear. "If I stay," she said, "it has to be because it's right. Not because I owe you, not because I'm afraid." Julian nodded. "Then stay because you want to build something real. Stay because you finally can." In that moment, the walls that had defined their arrangement, the formality, the restraint, the invisible lines, crumbled quietly, not in passion, but in understanding. Sophia stepped closer, resting her forehead against his chest, her breath mingling with his. It was not the beginning of a fairy tale, but the continuation of something earned, a love born not from fantasy but from endurance, respect, and truth. Months later, spring returned, and the house once again filled with light. The papers that had once bound them legally lay locked away in a drawer, irrelevant now. Camila visited often, her laughter echoing through the halls. Sophia completed her nursing certification and began working at a local clinic. The dream she had once thought impossible, now a reality. Julian, for his part, learned to slow down, to measure success not in profit but in moments. Dinners shared without agenda, evenings spent reading by the fire, music played not for performance but for joy. Sometimes, when the city lights shimmered in the distance and the night air carried the faint hum of life, Sophia would look across the room at Julian and remember the first night she had met him, when she had thought he was just another powerful man untouched by humanity. Now she knew better. They had saved each other in ways no contract could have designed. She had given him purpose beyond numbers, and he had given her the freedom to dream again. And though the world around them would always see their story as unlikely, the billionaire and the waitress, the deal turned into devotion. Those who truly knew them understood that it had never been about the transaction. It had always been about transformation, because sometimes life's greatest bargains are not made in ink, but in courage, down the courage to forgive, to trust, and to begin again. And in the quiet glow of a spring evening, as Sophia leaned against Julian's shoulder, watching the last traces of sunlight fade from the sky, she realized that she had found not the end of her story, but the beginning of everything that truly mattered.